Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of the Kid Bash Kitchen. Today we're going to put a new spin on an old American classic, the Dutch Apple Pie. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be kit bashing 3 separate recipes to create a new one. First, we're going to start with the classic Dutch Apple Pie recipe. The second is we're going to weave in elements of a candied walnut topping. That was part of an apple pie recipe served by a commercial restaurant chain known as Ruby Tuesdays. And then third, we're going to temper that with a German Apple Streusel Cake. Not to be confused with a German Apple Streusel, the rolled up flaky pastry with the raisins in it. This is actually going to be a cake recipe for which we're going to steal elements of the Streusel topping. And with any pie recipe, it all starts with the crust. Now, I've created one ahead of time. This is a typical pie crust recipe. It came straight out of the Betty Crocker cookbook. Nothing special other than the fact that it is a deep dish crust recipe, which we need to make sure that we can fit everything in. And without further ado, let's get started. So our first step is to set our oven for 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and we'll let that heat up while we're working on our next step. Now that we have our oven set for 400 degrees, it's time to prepare our apples, which we will peel, slice, and then chop. The type of apple used is something that most families have a particular favorite. I grew up with using Granny Smith as the quintessential apple for making apple pie. But some people like to combine different apple types together to make a unique taste. While going to the orchard to get my apples, I came across another variety that I think one-ups the Granny Smith. It's called a Calville Blanc de Hiver, which translates roughly as white horse of winter. Don't ask, I have no idea where the name came from. But if you must know, I suggest you consult your local 16th century French monk who recently immigrated from Normandy, France. So, here they are. It is a green apple, not unlike a Granny Smith. A little bit uglier, sorry, no offense. But you can pick this out of a crowd at your orchard just simply by looking at the top. It's got an octagonal shape to it, kind of like a stop sign with the edges rounded. So, if you get to an heirloom orchard, I strongly suggest that you give this a try. It's what we'll be using, but obviously use your favorite. And to cut our apples, we'll be using a simple apple slicer peeler that you can get at your local grocery store for about $10–15. The cool thing about using this is that it goes so fast that we won't have to sprinkle any lemon juice on our apple slices to keep them from browning, because we'll be getting to the next step before they ever have a chance. And it'll be even faster through the magic of video editing. So once we peel and then spirally slice our apples, we then quarter the individual slices to make them suitable for an apple pie. Okay, now let's move on to completing our pie filling, starting with 3/4 cup of white sugar, followed by 2 tablespoons of flour, a 1/2 tablespoon of cinnamon, and then finally we'll grab our grinder and some nutmeg here and then scrape off approximately 1/8 of a teaspoon's worth of fresh nutmeg. We will then stir this mixture until it is evenly distributed, and then pour it over our apple slices and toss until they are evenly coated. We then transfer our filling-coated apple slices into our prepared deep dish pie shell. And then once we get them all in there, we kind of rearrange them so that they're distributed evenly. And then finally, we build a mound of them in the center. Okay, now it is time to prepare our streusel topping. We will combine 1 stick of butter, which is already in the bottom of the bowl in the video, to 1 cup of flour and 1 cup of chopped walnuts and 1/2 cup of brown sugar. Then we will knead this mixture with my hand here until it turns into a crumbly dough. Okay, we'll now take our crumbly streusel topping and spread it evenly over our pie filling. And if you mounded the apple slices so that they are a bit shorter than the pie crust at the edges, the streusel topping will fill the rest of the space and it'll give the pie a nice, even, professional looking appearance when we're finished. In order to prevent our pie from over-browning prematurely, we will be covering it in aluminum foil for the first half hour of the baking cycle. We now place our pie in the oven for half an hour at 400 degrees. At this point, we have a half an hour to kill, so I spent my time trying to solve one of life's biggest puzzles. Once the first half hour of the baking cycle is complete, we remove the pie from the oven, and then we remove the foil from the pie. This is so that the pie has a chance to brown during the second half hour of the baking cycle. We will then return the pie to the oven and bake it for a second half hour or until it turns golden brown. Still working that puzzle for the second half hour. Okay, now that the second half hour of baking is complete, we place the pie on a wire rack to cool for at least 2 hours. Okay, now that the pie is completely cooled, we can slice it and serve it. It's a good time to talk about some potential variations to the pie. If you don't like the bitter taste of walnuts, you can substitute those with pecans. That also makes a pretty good pie. Plus, if you want a little bit more of a hearty taste, you can swap out half the flour in the streusel topping with whole wheat flour, and it gives it a bit of an earthy tone. Be careful, though, about making any other adjustments. If you reduce the butter and the sugar, you'll have a streusel that'll be essentially nuts and dust. And if you up the sugar and the butter, you will eventually invent a version of walnut epoxy that might have an industrial application, but for a culinary one, it might just be limited to chipping a tooth. So, that's it for today's episode. If you've liked what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. So until next time, keep kit bashing in your kitchen.